we're going to see a major effort to saddle American consumers with programmable, surveillable money and seizable money, and seeking to lead us into sort of this new neo-feudal paradigm that I mentioned earlier.
How are fear and panic being weaponized to take your wealth? Are Democrats and Republicans secretly serving the same financial giant? Was the vaccine passport a trial run for a digital ID to control every aspect of your life? Is a new feudal order coming to turn us into a modern slave class? Whitney Webb exposes the coming dangers and the names behind them.
I think when a crisis is happening, people tend to have emotional responses and tend to be coming from a place of fear. And that tends to prevent people from thinking critically or calmly or rationally about situations or about policies. And so a lot of, during COVID, obviously a lot of focus was on COVID-19 itself, on the biosecurity situation, not just so much on the financial situation. But for example, if there was a major crisis going forward that would greatly impact Americans' ability to engage in economic activity or have their purchasing power, close to wiped out or something, I think you would see a lot of people really beg for any policy response. Solve this crisis now, we need something, and not really have people think about what is the best policy response to this kind of crisis. People aren't going to think calmly and bring everything to the table, and it's very unlikely there will be some sort of calm, open public debate about it. Generally what happens is that the government says people are scared and emotional. They clamor for some sort of solution from the government, and the government offers some sort of solution. And, like with COVID-19, BlackRock anticipated the next downturn about a month before the repo market started going haywire, and presented to central bankers, this is the policy you should implement during the next downturn. And it's very possible that BlackRock is working on policy papers, for central bankers or other people in the U.S. government about what policy should be implemented if, this type of crisis happens or that type of crisis happens. It seems like they seem to be designing the policies, I guess. And they've, had, in the Biden administration over the past 4 years, they've been leading his former BlackRock executives have been leading his economic team, bringing us to where we are now, and likely influencing what will happen over the next couple of years whenever or up until this crisis emerges. So it seems, very likely that they'll be, dominating, fiscal response again. And then people, because they're not really aware of how this is developed, or really, there's just not a lot of media coverage about, for example, the role of BlackRock in the Biden administration, or in, on Kamala's economic team specifically. I've seen very little coverage, if any, of that. Recently, maybe a few blips here and there of when those people are appointed, but nothing significant beyond that. And then, of course, there was very little scrutiny of U.S. COVID fiscal response, I think, as well. And it's just sort of written off as this is what the government had to do to respond to the crisis in a lot of situations.
According to Whitney Webb, moments of crisis are opportunities to impose pre-planned policies without public consent. The role of financial giants like BlackRock is particularly revealing, showing who truly benefits from these major economic decisions.
But I don't think that's necessarily true, because, again, that fiscal response began well before, COVID was declared a pandemic by the World Health Organization, preceding that by like several months, right? So I don't know. I think it's a complicated situation. It's complicated to anticipate what will exactly happen. But again, history tends to repeat itself in these cases. And the fact that you have BlackRock so embedded with the Democrats specifically, and also have this historical precedent with Trump when he was in office last time, it seems very likely that they'll be doing this again. So I guess my role in this is to try and generate awareness so we can have a discussion before that time of crisis, when people are emotional and afraid and concerned about their money, about whether we should be having BlackRock at the helm of this when the next crisis emerges. I would say no.
Yeah. Okay. So let's ask the obvious question. Who should be in charge in that moment? Who do we put in charge of fiscal policy in times of crisis or otherwise?
I don't necessarily have the
Okay, the question becomes, how do we do that? So walk me through, just so that we're not talking abstract stuff, we're really bringing it down to earth. What are the interests of Main Street or the average American?
Well, I think regular Americans would like to stop having their money stolen from them or being misused on things where it's basically being sent to enrich multinational corporations, particularly in the war industry, where you have a lot of, there's been a lot said over the past several years, decades really, about the military industrial complex and how a lot of the wars that U.S. empire goes to start in other countries
Whitney,
generates a windfall.
I'm gonna stop you. I'm gonna stop you really fast, just because you know this stuff so well. That you'll fractal into 10 more extremely valid issues. But I want to start with, you just said regular Americans want to stop their money being stolen from them. I will say, I don't think the average American realizes that their money's being stolen. Whenever I bring that up, I feel like I'm screaming into the void. So how exactly are Americans' dollars being stolen from them?
Okay, I would say it's going to things that are not actually building necessary infrastructure or
Do you mean
meeting
tax?
Americans' needs.
So money's being taken from them via tax and just misspent?
Yeah, I think taxpayer money has been people taxpayer wealth, and the money brought in through taxes has been misused and essentially stolen for a very long time. If you look at the work of Catherine Austin Fitts and Mark Skidmore, for example, they noted that like $21 trillion of U.S. taxpayer money essentially was stolen, and they can't really explain what happened to it. So, that alone is very significant.
Let me ask, is taxation in and of itself theft?
I mean, I think under the current system, because if anyone's familiar with my work in my books, for example, I sort of argue that our government has been overtaken by this network of organized crime and intelligence agencies that have essentially fused their operations and did so in the immediate post-World War II era. And I think financing their operations when they're at the helm is not good, and that the fact that our money is being taken from us ostensibly to provide services to us, and if you believe in the development agenda abroad, the rest of the world, but we know if you look into it that that's not actually what is happening. This money is, so I think there's things that we can look at as far as BlackRock is concerned that sort of give us clues as to what their agenda may be.
Webb states the taxpayer money is systematically funneled to a handful of corporations. Behind this, she argues, is an ideology from figures like BlackRock's CEO, who find totalitarian governments more predictable and profitable. For these circles, democracy is seen as a risk.
And the most concerning thing to me about that, as it relates to people like Larry Fink, is that Larry Fink is on record saying things like markets don't really like democracies because they're messy. Markets like totalitarian governments. And Larry Fink is someone who's been very obsessed with risk management most of his career, and sees essentially, free democracies and arguably also a free market in some senses as, generating more risk than perhaps he would like to handle. So when you're able to sort of control and centralize both markets and governments, you're able to control the amount of risk that's there. And so maybe that's good for asset managers like Larry Fink, who are obsessed with this kind of stuff. But for, regular people, ultimately, it reduces the amount of freedom that we would have. So I sort of see Larry Fink as someone who's looking to centralize power and centralize wealth. And obviously that has major impacts on, regular Americans and the people that aren't necessarily in the oligarch class or in the top 1% that would benefit from those types of policies.
Whoa. Okay, that is extremely direct. Okay, so you have somebody who understands this is about risk mitigation, that a democratic government is going to have a lot more volatility. I mean, even as I think about America having this moral standing in the world, sort of being the world's cop, but every 4 years we have this sort of violent whiplash from one policy direction to the other. I've often thought about how jarring that must be to other world leaders. And so for better or worse, I can actually see what you mean. If somebody is investing in the marketplace and they want to make sure that they have a predictable level of risk so that they can not completely control the outcomes, but that they can narrow the band of outcomes so that they don't have this gigantic potential downside. And the way that we get that is totalitarian top-down control. Okay. That's a very clear thesis. Now the question becomes, how are they going about doing it? What are the mechanisms?
Well, I think this is something that's much larger than just BlackRock specifically, but in terms of looking at what BlackRock has done in terms of U.S. fiscal policy, I think it's important to sort of look at their role in, the '08 crisis, which began the policy of quantitative easing, and later on they were called upon by the Trump administration to help develop COVID fiscal response. But actually it began before then. So in the fall of 2019 at Jackson Hole, and this is also, should point out, this is based on the very excellent research of John Titus of the YouTube channel Best Evidence. Essentially, this document was presented by BlackRock to central bankers at Jackson Hole. It was called Going Direct, is what they called it. And basically the idea was to have what was generated via quantitative easing, not just go to public sector affiliated entities, but also directly into the hands of the private sector, i.e. Wall Street. And that was essentially what was proposed. And this begins to be implemented well before COVID, when the repo market goes a bit haywire. At the end of 2019, and sort of continues through up until COVID was declared a pandemic by the World Health Organization, at which point there's a lot of calls between Larry Fink and Steve Mnuchin and other top figures and the economic team of the Trump administration. And then they begin to basically affect this policy, or really supercharge this policy and go direct even more. So there's a lot of, things that are happening in terms of economic policy that ultimately resulted in what we're dealing with now, I guess, debasement of U.S. American consumer purchasing power. But a lot of this money at a time when there were lockdowns and there was really very little economic activity going on, they're being given all of this, people like BlackRock asset managers are being given all of this money, and then they go, and instead of helping out Main Street, they go up and buy up all the assets. They buy shares in their own ETFs, for example. And basically what happened during COVID was a massive wealth transfer. And if you look at the statistics of it, the top 1% in the United States benefited hugely during COVID, but the rest of us did not. Maybe some people got stimulus in that, but a lot of the consequences downstream of those policies have resulted in this inflationary situation we're in, and a lot of other, economic issues that people are dealing with. And
the going direct policy during COVID led to a massive wealth transfer. However, according to Webb, this was not an isolated incident. It's the result of a long-standing revolving door policy between Wall Street and the Treasury Department that has completely captured the system.
And so BlackRock's best answer to that, I guess, because I think our current system, specifically as it relates to, the U.S. Treasury Department, has consistently been a revolving door for the last several decades with Wall Street. And Goldman Sachs, for example, has had very significant former Goldman Sachs executives have held very prominent roles at the Treasury when crises have emerged. So as an example, you have one of the top guys at Goldman Sachs, Robert Rubin, being a key figure in the Clinton administration's economic policy as Treasury Secretary, and helping engineer the repeal of Glass-Steagall, which creates, arguably the 2008 financial crisis, when George W. Bush's Secretary Treasury at the time the crisis happens is Henry Paulson, another former top guy from Goldman Sachs, that allegedly told members of Congress if they didn't bail out the banks that martial law may be declared in the United States, for example. And then when the COVID fiscal response happened, Steve Mnuchin is a former top Goldman Sachs executive as well. So as far as, the big parties, Democrat and Republican, they tend to appoint people to Treasury that come from these top Wall Street banks that have a history of predatory and arguably criminal behavior. And so, I think there needs to be a much larger structural change, I guess, to prevent that type of revolving door policy if we're going to see any sort of meaningful fiscal response to a crisis that actually does take, the needs of regular Americans into account, because historically that is not what has happened. And the people that come to Treasury tend to have the best interest of Wall Street at heart and not the best interest of regular Americans at heart. And I think, again, that's sort of a phenomenon that's not exclusive to Treasury either. You have this type of revolving door phenomenon in really most aspects, if not all, of the U.S. government, where you sort of have regulatory capture, of the people supposedly regulating those industries. The industries themselves tend to have put their top people, at least these days, into those major regulatory positions through this revolving door phenomena. So I think we need to find a meaningful way to stop that before we can expect that, major government fiscal response would be designed with the interest of regular Americans at heart, with Main Street at heart and not Wall Street at heart. It's pretty clear that whoever is the next president is going to have to deal with some sort of U.S. government debt crisis. And I'm concerned about how that response is going to be, regardless of which candidate wins. So, for example, Trump, in his case, when there was a major economic crisis in the form of, what happened economically as a result of lockdown policy and because of COVID-19, the person that he and his administration reached out to was Larry Fink of BlackRock, who implemented something we can get into later that some researchers have called the Going Direct Reset, which was basically a way to put money from QE directly in the hands of the private sector instead of public entities, sort of like it had been done before. And arguably that resulted in a massive wealth transfer, and BlackRock didn't really use that money to help Main Street at all. They used it to buy shares in their own ETFs, among other things. And then Kamala, in her case, her entire economic team is essentially led by former BlackRock executives. And that was also true for the Biden administration. So essentially BlackRock, which was also played a major role in sort of developing the bailouts in the 2008 economic crisis, which was under Obama, right? Will likely be developing the response for whatever this, coming economic crisis is, regardless of who gets in office. If we look at, the policy actions of the people running, who they turn to in a time of crisis, or who is running their economic team, that seems increasingly likely. So that is why I'm very concerned, I guess I would say, about BlackRock in particular, because they seem to be the people that the government turns to, regardless of whether a Democrat or Republican is in office. And, they have sort of a history of really affecting wealth transfers during these crises at a time when, they're supposedly developing or helping develop policy meant to bail out Main Street. They end up sort of affecting massive bailouts for Wall Streets. And of course, the people that BlackRock are trying to generate profits for ultimately.
Whitney Webb emphasizes that BlackRock is positioned as the de facto crisis manager for both political parties. She now points to the danger that will be presented as the solution in the next crisis: programmable, controllable digital currencies with the potential to eliminate financial freedom.
And the other thing that I'm really concerned about as it relates to, a coming economic crisis is that I think we're going to see a major effort to saddle American consumers with programmable, surveillable money and seizable money. And so, of course, a lot of people for years now have been very concerned about central bank digital currencies or CBDCs. But there are also things issued by the private sector, like stable coins, for example, that are just as programmable and surveillable and seizable as CBDCs are. So I think it's very likely in the event of a major debt crisis or some sort of crisis that damages significantly regular Americans' purchasing power, there will be an effort to onboard Americans onto one of those two versions of programmable, surveillable money. So it's possible, if Kamala wins, we could see a CBDC or something like that. But in the case of Trump, he's sort of come out in favor of stable coins. He did that recently at his speech at the Bitcoin conference earlier this year. And, stable coins are just as programmable and surveillable and seizable as CBDCs in theory are. And I think those, as people have rightly pointed out, are a threat to our financial privacy and ultimately our financial freedom. So I think people should be focusing not just on CBDCs, but also, these other digital currencies that have the potential to offer those same, Orwellian functionalities to the people, issuing them and producing them. And some of those prominent stablecoins, like Circle, for example, have major alliances with BlackRock, and BlackRock has a minority stake in them, and have said in their some of their SEC filings that the stablecoins can be used to manipulate the price of Bitcoin, for example. The side part of this is that in order to ensure the integrity of the hectare on which each unit of token is based, you must surveil the forest. And so there's this whole idea of now creating the Internet of Forests, putting sensors on every tree and every hectare of the Amazon in order to ensure that no one's messing with it. And this may also at some point include, the indigenous people that live there, because, if 1 hectare has an indigenous tribe and less trees, right, as compared to another hectare that isn't inhabited, which one is more valuable in the eyes of investors, particularly if there's this effort to impose like a carbon market, a global carbon market, which some people like Mark Carney and other prominent, central bankers and other bankers have discussed at length as an alleged solution, to environmental issues in the world. I think that is something that should be talked about as well. And also the idea is to also use satellite surveillance. And so this particular effort to tokenize the Amazon specifically is teamed up with a satellite company called Satellogic. And Satellogic, the chair of the board is Steve Mnuchin, the former Treasury Secretary. And also on the board is a man named Howard Lutnick, who was recently named to be co-chair of Trump's transition team. And he's the longtime head of Cantor Fitzgerald, which is one of the main dealers of U.S. Treasuries, and also very intimately connected to the stablecoin Tether, which is also invested in Satellogic. So it'll be interesting to see exactly what goes on there as it relates to the satellite firm, which is also, in previous reporting I did with Mark Goodwin, who I mentioned earlier for Bitcoin Magazine, they've been involved in sort of this effort to create a carbon market in Latin America that was built on the Bitcoin blockchain specifically, which is something that I think a lot of, at least older school Bitcoiners who are not really into the idea of carbon markets or any of these things would be, quite against. But I think it's something that should definitely be talked about, the idea of, using satellite surveillance to back all of this stuff up, especially with a company like Satellogic that has, the people I mentioned on the board, but also are, vying for U.S. intelligence and military contracts. And the people that created that company are longtime contractors for DARPA and the NSA and U.S. intelligence. So you're going to have this satellite firm, surveilling large swaths of Latin America. If these efforts, one of which is called Green Plus and the other one called One Amazon, go through, you'll essentially have a company that's tied to, for important people that are, as it relates to the U.S. government, former officials, and also people that have historically been U.S. government and intelligence contractors, surveilling your environment from the sky without a national government really having any say in the matter.
According to Webb, the fusion of finance, technology, and intelligence agencies is creating a global surveillance network. Against this overwhelming power, Webb suggests turning away from centralized solutions and focusing instead on building strong, self-reliant local communities.
think that's unfortunately that world is having now more than ever an increased effect on our actual livelihoods and potentially seeking to lead us into sort of this new neo-feudal paradigm that I mentioned earlier. And so I think people need to be a lot less trusting of these particular people and of the fronts or the politicians that are, rolled out to sell these agendas to us, and that we need to rely more on the people in our communities, our friend groups, and our families that we know are good, and build resilient local communities with them. Because, if you, like yourself and myself, are concerned about an economic crisis coming down the road, it's very unlikely, if you look at historical precedent, that the government is going to actually do anything to save you, or that Wall Street will do anything to save you. It's much more likely that you'll be in a better spot to face that crisis if you build something local that can provide resilience for you and your family and your friends and your community in the face of that crisis. So I think we a lot of times, Americans and other countries as well, are sort of told that as long as we get the right guy in the White House, he'll magically fix everything, or all we need to do to ensure our country goes in the right direction is vote once every 4 years. I think it should be clear to people now more than ever that that is really very mistaken, especially now that we have two people running for office in the main parties that have both been in power before, that have been in the executive branch before, and we've seen what they've done. And I think people should focus a lot more on policy agendas rather than just rhetoric, because at the end of the day, most politicians, when they campaign, it's a sales pitch, and a lot of those people don't keep their promises once they get into office, and that's true of both Trump and the Biden-Kamala crowd. And I think people need to take more individual responsibility for their lives and stop waiting for some sort of savior to magically get in the White House to make everything better. So I think we've been led to believe, again, by being very trusting, that we don't have any agency to make things better. I think we absolutely do. And there are a lot more of us than there are of them. And there's power in numbers. And if people would organize on the local level, starting with making sure your friends and family are taken care of, because especially if you anticipate things are just going to get very crazy, which seems increasingly likely, whether it's in an economic sense or a social sense, making sure you have some sort of stability or network to fall back on, I think is very, very, very important.
Okay. So if we know that people are being too trusting, and if we know that this stuff is happening right before us, what specifically do we need to be vigilant for, vote against, whatever, however you want to think about it, that if we remain blind to, will lead to this new slave class?
In essence, Whitney Webb argues the ultimate goal is a society of total control. She identifies the keystone of this system as the push for a universal digital ID, which will be linked to a programmable currency to monitor and manage every single aspect of our lives.
So I think we should focus on specific policy agendas that are meant to take us there. And I think the cornerstone of those is the effort to create an all-encompassing digital ID that will determine what you can and can't access in your life. I would argue, and I wrote reports of at the time during COVID-19, and others did as well, that sort of the vaccine passport was a trial run for this digital ID vision. That's being implemented essentially globally and going to be rolled out over the next 2 years or so at the global level. And the idea of having a lot of the surveillance sucked up on you being linked to the digital ID, having it determine having your medical records in there, having your telecom in there, your social media account, really all of your aspect of life in this centralized digital ID is very problematic, especially if we saw during COVID, if you didn't have the right if you didn't get the vaccine, for example, you weren't allowed into places. It restricted your freedom of movement. Digital ID has the ability to restrict not just your freedom of movement, but really your access to everything, including information based on the blueprints that are out there by the public-private partnerships and associations that are developing it, like ID 2020, for example. And then there's the whole idea of linking this intimately with a digital wallet that, again, would have some sort of programmable, surveillable, and seizable currency, where, which, again, as I said earlier, has major implications for financial freedom and financial privacy. I think we need to focus a lot on those in particular, because a lot of consciousness was generated about those policy agendas during the COVID era and the risks of them. And, unfortunately, we're in a situation now globally where you have people both on the left and the right marketing these policy agendas under very different metrics that they think their base will be most receptive to. So in the case of, Donald Trump, for example, he's calling for a biometric entry exit system as a way to tackle illegal immigration. A campaign lawyer of his went on a podcast a few months ago saying that biometric facial recognition would be a way to stomp out the voter ID or the voter fraud issue and institute voter ID. And you can support voter ID, but why can't we just have physical driver's license or the type of, IDs people have always had? Why does it have to be, a biometric facial recognition thing? And unfortunately, Trump's vice presidential candidate,